About a month ago, I decided to do something challenging. Instead of going through some of my more recent photos, I decided to go check out some of my older ones. And I was going through some of the winter shots I had of Greece in the winter of 2019. And then all of a sudden, I came across a few photos I took of the Grevena Outdoor Market Bazaar. I was truly attracted to all the colors, and it looked very challenging. There was several people in the photo, lots of fruit. I figured it would be a nice challenge to do. I unwrapped a small canvas. I knew what I was going to be up against, but I was like, what the heck, why not? You only live once. Just like every other painting I would do, I start out with the underpainting. I lay out simple shapes and bodies of color to establish the overall composition. I don't get too detailed right away. I just want everything to be in the right place, or at least as close as possible. I did not grid this painting, and nor did I do a pre-drawing either. I just went straight to painting, and I relied on the properties of acrylic paint to get me through. Unlike oil, acrylic dries quickly, and I knew if I made mistakes, I could just paint right over them. I do always say painting is a constant form of correction, and this is very true with the process of this painting. There's an unspoken rule in art or painting when it comes to being accurate. What I mean by that is you know what you can get away with not being accurate. For example, those apples in the painting can be off by a little bit and no one will know. But when it comes to painting the proportions of people, that has to be as accurate as possible or your painting will look very off. So from the beginning, I had the mindset to make sure features like the face, hands, and the proportions of arms and legs were as accurate as possible to the photo that I was using. And there were a total of 7 people in my painting. Besides the people, there was also some text, and honestly, I'm not very good at reading Greek, but I tried to paint what I saw accurately. I paid attention to the change of color, even if it was by a small amount, because lighting was hidden certain signs in particular ways where certain characters were brighter than others, and I had to establish a sense of light in this painting. From my understanding, the sun was setting when I took the photo, and the sunlight from the west was hitting the person directly and his apples as well. Even the other people behind him are also getting hit with this light as well. And because of how bright the sunlight is, there is also a lot of contrast. And it was my goal to try to amplify it a little more, particularly the guy in the red jacket and the apples, of course. I was using pure yellows and oranges in certain areas, like this guy's black jacket. And certain things, like these oranges in the distance, were made up of primarily just yellow and orange as well. It's not always good to use colors straight out of the two, but in this scenario, I felt it was necessary because how pure those two colors looked. Since those oranges were in the distance, I didn't go too detailed, but used simple shapes of circles and line work to create the illusion of the fruit in the distance. Because of the lack of detail here, it will help amplify the sense of depth. When I create the apples that are the closest to the viewer, those for sure will be very detailed and full of lots of color and contrast as well. Besides capturing the light, my other goal was to try to capture a lot of little details that would normally get overlooked. This scene is, in a way, kind of chaotic, especially behind the scenes. There's a scale, something that looks like a little register, clear containers and scoops, and even a bag with mountain tea. The bag itself was quite hard to paint. I made several attempts at it throughout the process. There was also a very faint logo on it. I'm not sure what it is, but I painted what I saw. But most importantly, I tried to capture how the light affected the sharp edges and change of color of the wrinkled bag. A notable detail that I would like to point out was the basket that had eggs. It was kind of fun to paint the leaves. I'll be honest, I didn't capture it exactly how I saw it, but nonetheless, the slightly different variations of brown eggs and the way the woven basket came together was fun to paint. There was also some lettuce and cabbage too that was sandwiched between the eggs and the apples. They don't occupy too much of the painting, but they were there and I included them, but they were not too detailed because I know the apples that were in front were definitely going to be the stars of this painting. When you look at the photo, you probably are wondering, how the heck did I paint all those apples? It was very simple. One by one, actually. But I did have a process. For those that are familiar with my grass videos, it's kind of similar to painting a bunch of apples. Instead of grass blades, it's a lot of circular shapes, and they're all different colors instead of being just a variation of green. Anyhow, it's very important that you lay out a nice body of color for the underpainting first. I did several variations of green, red, and yellow because the merchant did a really good job organizing the apples with a sense of pride. And quite honestly, the nice job he did displaying his fruit made doing the painting a lot easier. I have a feeling if they were all mixed up, I would have had quite a challenge. After painting the bodies of color and establishing a division among the apples and the different colors, I began to start to paint them. I start from the back and I work my way to the front. I don't go full into detail right away, but I try to establish a few particular apples that stand out and the lights and darks that help shape them out. Initially, I was trying to be as accurate as possible, but I realized at one point I'm going to have to invent a few apples and subtract some as well. But the important thing I was trying to depict is the sense of volume of each one. And by using color as well as lights and darks helped. But I also progressively made the apples more and more detailed as you get closer to the front. And not only that, scale played a very important role. For example, the apples further back are smaller, but as you get closer, they get bigger. And it makes sense if you want to establish the illusion of depth and distance. And lastly, something that will be more noticeable at the very end is detail. The apples in the back are formed with just a few brush strokes, while the ones in the front are going to have more unique properties. And I will pay attention more to the different colors and texture that makes each apple stand out from the others. Text in a painting can make or break it, but there's some simple rules you need to follow when creating it. You do not want to just write, you want to paint it the way it is, and also pay attention to perspective. Sometimes it's a trial and error process, and thankfully with acrylic paint, once the paint is dry, you can make those corrections almost instantaneously. Some little tricks I use are counting the amount of characters and kind of making place markers of where they would be before fully rendering each letter. And also paying attention to the lighting. Some characters are going to be darker and some are going to be lighter depending on how the light is hitting them. The text on that one sign that's behind the man with the red jacket is actually backwards and see-through as well. I believe it's a piece of cloth hanging. The way I did it is I painted the characters the way I saw them, not what they are, and did my best to give the illusion of it being see-through and the lighting, of course. The lady with the cell phone. I had a few difficult moments painting her, only because she occupies such a small portion of the painting. But I think she's a nice addition to this very busy composition of where she's having a conversation with someone. Plus, I suspect that she actually was looking directly at me when I took the photo, especially the way her head is tilted. But I would never know for sure because she is wearing sunglasses. Of all the people that I painted, she was definitely the hardest. Pay attention to the video. The placement of her head initially was way off, and then I corrected later. The other thing I was having a hard time was getting the glasses to fit the face correctly. Her head is actually the size of a quarter on the canvas, so painting the little details and features was quite a difficult task. I actually took a break at one point from doing her face and just started the rest of her body because I felt like I had to move on, and later I will go back and try to correct it. Again, I started to appreciate the properties of acrylic paint. Because it dries so quick, I made lots of corrections on the spot. Like these ladies' feet, I believe I got them wrong the first round, and honestly, I'm not too sure if I got them right the second round. Anyhow, the tiles. Yes, the tiles on the ground. They're hexagons, they're not squares, so they were definitely on the more difficult side. But it was really a trial and error process to get them as correct as possible. I started trying to mimic a pattern when creating them, and then as I got further and further to the back, they became less detailed and more blurry. The hardest part to paint in this painting was definitely the crates. At first glance, they do not seem like much, but there's a lot to them. For example, there's lots of lines, and there's actually some openings also between the lines, and to top it off, there are some apples in some of the crates. And lastly, the lighting. Portraying the change of lighting, shadows, and the sunlight was a trial and error process. And again, thanks to acrylic paint, you will see how I constantly kept repainting this section. I paid attention to how bright the crate was from the direct sunlight. The brighter areas was mostly cadmium orange and yellow, and less red, believe it or not. The crate itself also casted a lot of shadows within each side. Each of those lines you see respond differently to the direct sunlight and cast shadows. I used some blues to cool down the areas in the shade, but surprisingly, they were also on the warmer tone. So for some of the deep reds, I had to use alizarin crimson. Nonetheless, the biggest battle wasn't really the color, but the line work. It was a constant battle of making sure the perspective was right, the shadows, and some of the fruit that was barely visible through those little crevices. Without a doubt, the crates were the hardest things to paint. Around this moment of the painting, I realized the lady's head was not in the right spot. But instead of trying to fix it, I kind of took a little breather from it and worked on the rest of her body, as well as the background instead. She's in front of a store that has a giant glass window for the storefront, and there's lots of reflection visible. But instead of going into detail, I just made the impression of the reflection of the environment on that window. Plus, I also focused on the concrete too, that formed the rest of the building below the window. The most interesting thing to paint on this lady was definitely her jacket and scarf. She had one of those puffy jackets that had a lot of little interesting details, like the belt buckle, little buttons, pockets, but really it was the scarf that was the most fun to paint. But before I get into the scarf more, I had to correct the placement of her head. Besides, what good would a detailed scarf be if the head of the figure was off? So I corrected her face, the glasses, and the nose. This was probably the second hardest thing to paint, probably because of how small her head was in the overall canvas. Again, lots of trial and error, but thanks to the acrylic paint being able to dry quickly, I was constantly able to correct things. I tried focusing on lights and darks in order to sculpt her face and her features, but the most challenging part was probably her eyes between the glasses and her eyebrows being slightly visible where they were. You will see I had to repaint this section again because it didn't look right. It was probably the distortion from the lenses that was probably throwing me off, and at some point the frames were too thick and I had to make them thinner. This part stressed me so much that I jumped to an entirely different section, which is this blue crate at the very bottom. That way I can kind of rethink on how to approach the rest of her face. After I felt that I was satisfied with her face, it was time to work on the scarf again. There were definitely a lot of lines of colors, and I painted very carefully. I didn't copy the pattern exactly, but I tried to make sure that the line work followed the flow of the scarf to help give it a sense of volume instead of being a flat piece of fabric on her. So I paid attention to the curvature and each fold as I painted. Among the other little details that I tried to capture were the translucent bag and the little tear on her pants. The tear was easy, but the bag required a little more work, such as the streaks of light and the folds. And it appeared that there was some sort of cylinder that stood out in the bag, and I tried to define it as best as possible. I went back to working the crate at the very bottom again and started to do the lettering. But also you could see the tiles through some of the crevices as well, so I started to paint between them. And also because of all the features of the crate, there were lots of intricate lines of lights and shadows that I tried to capture. But this was not as difficult as the red one, probably because it was not in direct sunlight with multiple colors. And here is another bag. This one is not as translucent and it is tied at the very top. But my main focus of the bag was trying to define what is inside it, which I actually do not know. But I saw some visible shapes and did my best to interpret them, with lights and darks and of course highlights at the very end. Speaking about creating form with lights and darks, this is how I also did the main guy's face. When I paint, I try to think like a sculptor. So I think of how the lights and darks carve out the features on a piece of rock or clay. But it's more than just that. You gotta focus also on the colors and the transitions. For example, things in the light are gonna be warmer and brighter, and things in the shade are going to be on the cooler side. And also because his face was tilted down, I had to focus a little bit on perspective and give off the illusion that his forehead is actually the thing that sticks out the most, and to make sure the rest of his face recedes, particularly the bottom where his beard and mouth are. I believe I went back to his face at least 3 or 4 times to correct things. The last time will be featured towards the end of the video, where I tried to correct his nose. Painting his jacket was very interesting. I did like that it was red and it was close to the center of the painting, because red is a very good way to capture someone's attention. But there were a lot of unique qualities to the jacket. For one, it was nylon and there were lots of little wrinkles. Not the folds, little wrinkles. I tried to depict this by trying to use more line work instead of blending the acrylic while it's wet. As for the red itself, there were a lot of variations, warm and cool, light and dark. I paid very close attention to the photo and tried to match as best as I could what I saw. Some of the colors I used were cadmium red, orange, some yellow, cobalt blue, alizarin crimson, and I believe even some viridian to get some of the darks, and also ultramarine blue here and there. And of course, a little bit of white to get the lighter tones. I will be honest, for some of the folds and details, I had to simplify them in order to keep moving on with the painting. But there were 2 things that I had to paint correctly, or the rest of the illusion will be a failure. Can you guess what they were? Yes, the hands. Not only painting the hands, but them holding some apples. But between the 2 hands, his left was definitely the hardest to depict, because the way it's stretched out, the tendons are somewhat visible. And there's also lots of little lights and darks throughout his hand because the way he's gripping the apples. There's some visible tension, and what better way to depict it by delicately painting hard edges and lines that will result in lots of changes of color. But if you remember at the beginning of the video, I just used some simple shapes of color as place markers just to set them where they possibly will be. And now, since I'm more approaching the finishing line, I am applying all the little details and also rendering the apples that he's holding. Just imagine though, if I did the reverse and spent quite a long time detailing those hands at the beginning stages, only to find out they're in the wrong spot. That would have been such a waste because it's not like I could just move them. I have to repaint them again. That's why it's always good to do an underpainting first to get the groundworks of proportions and the placement of things accurately before you go into details. And this is the part of the painting where I start going back into areas and fine-tuning things. I start with the red crate because I feel that still needed more work. I added some faint text. It's not readable, but it's in perspective. And I also enhanced some of the colors, particularly the crevices, because there were fruit that were visible, and I tried to make them more clear in the painting. There were also a lot of things in the top left corner that needed a little more attention. It was a lot of minor touch-ups, such as the bag, the scoop, the containers, but I did add a rope. I believe it's something that is holding the tent together that covers the merchant's stand. A lot of this that I did was off camera, unfortunately, because in the end, sometimes you spend so much time to do so little. And I have a feeling if I filmed and recorded this, it would have probably been a little boring. For sure, early stages like the underpainting are definitely more exciting. For sure, I definitely went back into the apples, but before I do, I spent a little time on the blue cloth, both on the left and the right side. I spent a little more time detailing the color and the way the light hits it, but also darkening some of the crevices where the apples are to make it believable that they're sitting on this cloth. Plus, I had to give off the illusion that it is not a flat table, and it seems like there's sections like a big divided tray, so the fruit doesn't spill over. And now it was time to go back into the apples. Just like before, I started from the back and worked my way to the front. While the first round was all about placing the apples where they should be, this time I was focused more on detail. I believe I added a few and removed a few as well, but for the most part, I focused on individual apples one at a time in some scenarios. To make a few stand out, I focused on contrast, making them light and dark in the right spot so they stood out, especially for the ones that are more up close, to help establish a sense of depth. I also wanted to portray the sunlight a little better, so I started applying more highlights on the apples. They were for the most part very shiny, and almost pure white with maybe a hint of yellow or orange does wonders when it comes to painting bright spots. But overall, the biggest thing I focused on were the colors. Everything from reflective and the temperature. If you look very carefully at the apples, you will notice there are many different colors and variations. They even have specks of color and little dots here and there. In some scenarios, I even exaggerate it with either a pure red, yellow, or orange. There are many different colors and variations, and I did my best to add even more. But another important thing I want to point out are the cool and warm colors. Obviously, things in the light are going to be warmer and brighter, but there are some apples that have some shade or are in slight darkness. I paid close attention to the temperature of color with each one, especially towards the end, and also the reflection of each apple. Some colors would bounce around, so you will see some greens in the red and reds in the green, and so on with the yellows and orange. But the important thing was that I was paying very close attention to each one at one point, and the color, both temperature and also how light or how dark it would be. And once again, the guy's face. As mentioned before, I was not too satisfied with his nose, and I went back into it. It was kind of hard to depict because of the angle of his head. But at the same time, I paid more attention to certain features of his face and also touched up his hair. Now, if you pay attention to this part where I am reworking the tree's bark, you will see how I hid my signature. It's 2 X's and a 23. But the main reason I redid the bark is to increase the contrast between the 2 crates and the tree. But I did also see it as an opportunity for my signature. The last few things that I touched up were the jacket, the back of the guy's head, and the bag. The goal was to rework the texture of the jacket, but for the head, it was to emphasize how bright the sun was. It almost appeared as if the light was burning the back of his head. An important note about the bag is that I went against the photo. It had a shadow casted from the pole and the number 50 on it, and it looked too confusing to portray, so I simplified by outright removing the number and the shadow. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I do truly appreciate it. To summarize the whole process of doing this painting, all I have to say is at least appreciate acrylic for its drying properties that allow you to correct things on the spot. Anyway, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. Oh yeah, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Bye now.